and kneaded and balled them, rolling each to the back of the table. Then, arms and shoulders needing a rest, he walked to the opening in the side wall and stood breathing white blooms at the bush. He was aging, along with his clays, but he was no longer cold. He returned to the wedging table and made up 6 more balls, then transferred the balls to boards and began ferrying the loads into the workshop and piling the balls on the bench top to the right of the wheel. Already he could feel the difference in the air. The pine splits had burned down to ember. He added more, then a chunk of iron bark, and closed the vent to a whisker. He needed the room warm, not hot. He carried the now burbling kettle to the wheel and topped up the slurry bowl into which he'd be dipping his fingers. It was time he settled. He wanted 8 large bottles for the risers directly behind the firebox. He could see the form, the weight towards the foot, yet with shoulders to catch the fly ash that gusted through the kiln and would melt and run. Thicker walls than he'd usually throw, the heat there massive and prolonged. Half might survive. He'd settle for half. The wheel stood between the 2 western windows and an embayment in the bench. It was his oldest friend. He'd made it himself at 18. Its design identical in every respect to Seth Bligh's. But its timber mountain ash, the staple framing tree at the mill in Blackheath, where he'd first encountered the man. He'd replaced the crank and chain, the flywheel bearing twice, and the saddle pad more times than he could remember. But the wheel was the same, his first and only. He took a dozen plywood bats from the rack where they stood like unsleeved LPs and placed the stack within reach when he sat, then snatched up a handful of clay from the waste bucket on the floor and roughly balled it. He hoisted himself into the saddle and slapped the ball onto the centre of the wheel head, kicked the bar to set the wheel spinning, and pushing down and out with his thumbs, worked the clay into a thin pad to take the bats. When it was level, he stopped the wheel and picked up a bat and the sponge. He dampened each side and dropped the sponge back in its bucket, then positioned the bat on the pad and hammered around its rim with his fist to seat it. He swivelled, and with both hands lifted the first of his throwing balls and slapped it onto the bat, then set the wheel spinning again and slurried his hands and drew the clay up into a cone, feeling its centre. He pushed down, combed it again, and again pushed down, then opened a well in the clay with his thumbs and formed the floor of the bottle. He inserted the fingers of his left hand into the well, and their pressure, opposed by the crooked index finger of his right on the outside of the ball, pulled the clay up into a thick, walled cylinder, his torso rising in unison, on a long, slow in-breath, his elbows flaring. He leaned and reinserted his hand and wrist and repeated the pull, drawing the cylinder higher and thinning the walls, then re-slurried his fingers and on the next pull formed the belly and shoulder and collared the top, leaving enough fatness for the neck. He let the wheel coast and cocked his head and studied belly and shoulder. Satisfied, he drew up the neck and gave it a rolled rim, then reached the slurry bowl for the strip of soaking chamois to smooth the lip, its touch slicker than any finger. He slowed the wheel and leaned back and to his right, hands withdrawn, but not yet dismissed. What he'd seen in his mind now existed. He was pleased in particular by the curve of the shoulder, mirrored in reverse where shoulder met neck. "You'll do," he said modestly. He brought the wheel to a stop and laid the chamois half submerged again in the slurry bowl, reached for the wire and made the shrinkage cut between bat and bottle base, then levered the bat from the wheel head, lifted it in both hands, and twisting from the waist, slid bat and bottle onto the left-hand wing of the embayment. Twisting right, he plucked the sponge from its bucket and squeezed it out, picked up a fresh bat and dampened its faces, then positioned